Είναι πραγματικά τιμή μας και χαρά μας που υποδεχόμαστε τον καθηγητή Richard Boyatzis, ο οποίος είναι πολύπλευρος, πολυτάλαντος, με ελληνικές ρίζες. Professor Richard Boyatzis, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I was taken aback by how many fields you have mastered. You're a distinguished university professor of Case Western Reserve University, professor in the departments of organizational behavior, psychology, and cognitive science. A prolific author, you've written more than 200 scholarly articles, 75 practitioner articles on coaching, leadership, competencies, emotional intelligence, neuroscience, and management education. And I love the way that you combine everything in a holistic approach. The author of 9 books and fellow of the Association of Psychological Science, the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology, and the American Psychological Association. I could be talking for hours about your CV, but we'd rather listen to what you have to say and your experience that you want to share with us. Thank you very much for being with us. The microphone is yours.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Δημήτριος. Συγγνώμη, το ελληνικάς μου δεν είναι πολύ καλά, so I'm going to have to do this in English. The topic that Demetrius asked me to talk about was a lot of our work on how do we help people learn and change in a way that sticks. And certainly this has haunted the fields of education since time immemorial. And in fact, several of my colleagues and I produced a book based on data we'd been collecting over a number of years, asking the question in 1995, why don't we think about what our students are learning instead of focusing so much on what we're teaching? So what I'm going to do is share my screen and try to organize a number of thoughts. During the process, we will do at least one exercise, and then I hope to have enough time for you to be able to unmute and ask your questions directly. By the way, my email is on the front slide here, so that if throughout the talk there's certain references that I'm talking about that you'd like to get copies of, or you have a story to tell me or want to share something, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm starting with an observation that learning and change is stressful, and that at the doses that we are normally exposed to, we being, I'm going to speak to adults right now, which in psychology usually means people 26 and over, but at the level of annoying stress, somebody cuts you off in traffic, your cell phone drops a call. Those are the things that happen to us. And at the normal dosage that we get in a typical day, pre-COVID, we are impaired. We're emotionally, cognitively, and perceptually impaired. We don't appreciate it fully, and sometimes we let it slip. But the fact is that we're not at our best. And we certainly feel under attack in some way, mild to extreme. You add to it the both fears of the COVID pandemic, you add to the financial disruptions, you add to the social and political disruptions that are going on, and even such immediate issues as the horrible invasion of the Ukraine by the Russian forces a few days ago, that we're exposed to excuse me, a lot of things that invoke acute stress on top of all this. Now, on top of that, everybody in this audience, as educators or as professors, are people who are involved in trying to help other people learn. According to Dave McClellan, years ago when he was studying this, it was very clear that those of us in the helping professions, including physicians, nurses, therapists, clerics, managers, even parents, we have an extra dose of stress because we feel the responsibility of our role in trying to help someone learn or change. And that's called power stress. What I'm going to talk about today is how we can approach working with our students, colleagues, clients, subordinates, children, in ways that might help them open up to learning and change, and how you can deal with yourself to renew and revitalize you neurologically and hormonally so that you're open and you're excited about it. But I find that talking about emotions and relationships is kind of shallow and cold unless you get into it. So we're going to do an exercise right now. I'm going to ask you to do these reflections, and then I will ask you to use the chat box to write in the answers to the question when I ask it, not right away, but when I ask it, about how you reacted. So here's the beginning part of the exercise. I want you to think about who helped you the most in your life become who you are or get to where you are. And think about your whole life, not just work. Who helped you the most? I'll go silent for about 30 seconds and I'll let you write down on a piece of paper names of a few people that come to mind. Who helped you the most in your whole life become who you are? I apologize for interrupting your reflections. You can keep adding names, but what I'd like you to do right now is go back to the first person you thought of on the list, and next to their name, remember a moment in which you learned something important from them. And if it was one of your parents, it might have been hundreds of these moments, but let your mind filter and your memory latch on to one moment in which you learned something important. Next to their name, write down a few words as to what they said or did in that moment. In a sense, try to replay the YouTube video in your head of that moment. And then if you do that for the first person, do it for the second person on your list, and or do it for the third. Now I'll go silent for about a minute so you can write some of your notes. Again, I apologize for interrupting your reflections. What I want you to do right now to help us, because we're going to analyze this, your reflections in two different ways. I would like you to write in on the chat how you feel right now. What's the emotion that you're feeling, remembering these individuals, these moments? What are you feeling right now? Happy, I'll repeat it to others. Moved, warm, grateful, uh, perseverance, nostalgia, which usually means a little sad if the person passed away, happy and fulfilled, warm and powerful, grateful again, more grateful, lucky, fulfilled, worried, more grateful, inspired, respected, moved, more grateful, grateful, happy. So I'm asking you to just write in the emotion that you're feeling or emotions, not analyzing it. Confident. I'll wait for a few more. Generally happy. Wise. And that's an interesting one. Gratitude, confident, relieved. Strong, proud. Again, grateful. Balanced. Interesting. Stronger, more grateful, motivated. This is very good. So let me go back to a little bit of why we're doing this. I've done this exercise at least once a week, sometimes more than once a week, since 1999. The first time I tried it was at a big conference in Firenze, in Italy. And I've done it on all 7 continents, about 65 countries. And the fact of what you talked about in terms of the emotional reaction is what people often say. It doesn't matter whether they're in Astana, Kazakhstan, or Milano, or Chicago. What they say is, I felt really grateful. I felt proud. I felt loved. Somebody cared for me that much. What a few of you started to say that often people say is that sometimes people say they felt excited or engaged. Some of you said happy. Sometimes people say they felt serene. Sometimes, as several of you said, they felt nostalgic, which very often means is a code for I felt sad that the person passed away. If you had any of those feelings, not all, any of them, at that moment that I asked you, you had just spent about 4 minutes in the parasympathetic zone, in the hormonal condition of your body. It's called the parasympathetic nervous system. I'll explain it in a few minutes, but let me shorthand say this state is the only medical state which reverses the damage that stress causes and helps you get excited about life, helps you be open to learning and change. I will explain more of the details in a little bit, but I wanted to flag that because one of the reasons I do this exercise is people aren't very good at the somatic or biological markers, the self-awareness of when they're being in what I call a renewed state versus a stress state. And by the way, if you haven't talked to one of the people on your list, please, it's Saturday this weekend, give them a call. Don't just email. Of course, if you could stop by them, see them, even better. And just say, I was thinking of you. And if sadly the person has passed away, sit down with a cup of coffee or tea this afternoon or tomorrow morning. Look at some photographs. Remember moments with them in which you laughed and cried. It's a good thing. The most important question I'm going to ask you in my session this morning, or for you this afternoon, we're actually not going to analyze, but I want you to consider it later. Reflect about it. Whose list will you be on? Whose list will you be on? Now, I've got to say this is a little bit of a cheat question to a group of educators because we're in the position to have tremendous impact on many people whose lives, whose spirits we touch. But it's important to think about it. Okay, now let me go into the analysis of this. And to get into the analysis. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. To get into the analysis, I'm going to go back to my screen. My parents immigrated from Greece. My father from Thessaloniki, my mother from Lutro, Prostatis Frakia, in Crete, in the 30s. And by the time my father got out, because he immediately took out citizenship papers and was enlisted in the U.S. Army, worked in the jungles of Panama, and then landed on Omaha Beach and spent most of the latter part of World War II going through France and Germany. By the time he got out of the U.S. Army, he had started his university education at Aristoteli in Thessaloniki, but he forgave that. He had been married. He got married to my mother, and he did what every Greek male on my side of the Atlantic did. Everyone that I knew growing up went into the restaurant business. And my father was a waiter for most of his life. Owned a little shop, luncheonette toward the end, but mostly was a waiter. And the reason that's important is that I grew up in an environment where there wasn't much money, and we were safe and we were taken care of and loved. But there was always a certain amount of a struggle. And one of the things that happened is that in my kindergarten, first grade, and third grade, and then again in fourth grade, people at PS 150, the elementary school I was going to in Queens, New York City, had tried to lead me back because in 1950, when you spoke with a Greek accent, I could read Greek before I could read English. One of the things that it was labeled was as a sign of retardation or cognitive problems. Was not seen as multiculturalism in those days. And God bless her, my mother fought hard. I mean, every time this started, she would keep me out of school for a few weeks, catch me up, and then send me back into school. During that time, my mother also spent a lot of time inculcating with me how much I had to fight for myself and defend myself. She said, all of these Americans, all these Northern Europeans are really out to get you. She was the embodiment of xenos. And oddly enough, even though that made my prejudices somewhat extreme for a while, it also emboldened me to be a fighter. And I've got to say, nobody moves ahead in the academic world without having a very thick skin and fighting for every review of every paper and every publication and every innovation against school administrators that you want to try. But one of the things that happened was in about my 6th grade, they tested us because Sputnik went up and everybody in the United States was, kind of energized to try to get back into the space race and try to beat the Russians. And what happened was they discovered through the testing that I was really smart in math and physics. So I got channeled into a program at the time was very advanced, but where we did junior high school, and 2 years of college before we graduated from what's our high school. I had always wanted to be in the space program since I was like 9. All of that stuff and all my specialization, I got into MIT. And my degree was aeronautics and astronautics. My specialty was control systems of interplanetary vehicles. Problem was I ran out of money about a year and a half short of graduating. But MIT got me a job working in a space research group for Northrop Norway, a company that made a lot of different kinds of planes and tried to make certain rocket ships at the time. This is 1966. And the importance of this is that I had to put myself through school because my parents could not give me much money and I had a certain number of scholarships, but in the US system, it's very expensive and you've got to work while you're going to school and all the rest of this stuff. Anyway, I saved up enough money to finish, but the major thing that happened is I learned that I didn't like doing the work. That being in space was exciting, but I wasn't going to be allowed to be in space. I mean, the Air Force had made it very clear to me at the time that because I had to wear glasses, there was no way I was going to be an astronaut in 1966. So what I said was, what am I going to do? I don't want to be a scientist engineer in this area. I don't want to go into the restaurant business. I'd used my money from my music. I played in a number of bands to help pay my way through MIT, but I didn't think I was quite that good that I could really make a living at it. So I said, okay, I'll go into management. So I went back to MIT and I signed up for a couple of courses in management that didn't have prerequisites. And one of the professors describing his course, because they did it to 600 of undergraduates interested in taking these courses, it was a young fellow, David Kolb. Many of you know him because of his work on experiential learning theory and the learning styles inventory. And he was just finishing his PhD at Harvard in psychology, and he talked about a course which to me sounded unbelievably foolish. Excuse me, the correct word is saglamabis. It was organizational psychology. But he said 2 words in his description that made me literally run down to the basement to get into his classroom, and I made it into the course. By the way, the 2 words were no tests. It turned out, I discovered years later in the midst of my clinical work in psychology that I'm test phobic and that I don't do well on when I have to sit down and do a test compared to when I'm asked to do something or there's no time limit, things like that. So the test phobia led me to make a choice that changed the course of my life. I like mentioning that because sometimes we think our lives are planned and they aren't. Anyway, Dave Kolb, when I wanted to do my term paper on how managers don't help their subordinates, citing my experience in this research group. I mean, if you watch Big Bang Theory, the American TV show, it was like there were 2 departments of Sheldons. We were all really smart and some scary smart, and I couldn't believe how little the managers got out of us. Well, Dave Kolb said, I just finished collecting data on 2 years of studies of the 28 to 30-year-old graduate students in MIT's version of an MBA as to how they were helping or not helping each other in weekly collection of data points along these 2 semesters. He said, do you want to work on some real data? It's not exactly what you said, but it's close. It's helping peers. I said, sure. I worked on it. He liked what I did. He offered me a job for the summer. And we ended up publishing a number of the papers. But that's where this theory started in the spring of 1967. And by the way, he then introduced me to a number of people and got me into doctoral seminars at MIT and at Harvard. And the next thing I know, I was entered into the PhD program in psychology at Harvard. But what became clear during my 55 years or so of studying change, first in graduate school, then a lot of the 70s, I was doing research on competencies, but then also studying change because I was training therapists and doing psychotherapy with alcoholics and drug addicts, and then shifted to focusing on leaders and managers. And in 87 became a full-time professor. And since then have studied 25 to 65-year-olds in how they sustainably change individually, but then also in teams, etc. So what's clear from all this research, longitudinal research, is that you need complexity theory to understand learning or change. Sustained learning and change, what you retain or a person retains, is hardly ever linear and is hardly ever continuous. So it happens in fits and starts, a property called discontinuity, or just basically nonlinearity in complexity theory. And when there are these moments where something pops that's important, it's called emergence. And what I discovered since the late 60s is that there always seems to be 5 types of emergence for those people who sustainably learn and change. The first one is the ideal self, the red oval. This is, what kind of person do you want to be? What do you want out of life? These are not goals. This is your dream. I'll explain later why neurologically dreams and vision are much more potent than goals. If you have some personal vision, a dream, then you're eligible for the second. If you don't, there's maybe a 5% chance you'll get there. This is why so little training in leadership or management, so little education in any field is effective, is because very often we're treating the problem or the goal, not the whole person and their emotional and neurological state. So if you have some part of a personal vision, you're eligible for the real self, which is not what do you think of yourself, because that's delusional. We've known that since the 50s. This is how do other people experience you. And you end up creating, in a sense, a personal balance sheet. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Then you go to the, if you're changing in a sustainable way, you experience the third moment of emergence, which is you develop an agenda, something you want to try. Now, this is not a performance improvement plan. This is not doing what your mother says you should do. This is doing what you would love to be doing, getting you closer to that vision, using your strengths, maybe working on a weakness. That takes the lowest position of priority. Then the fourth moment of emergence is as you're starting to experiment with new thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and then you morph into practicing them more to the point of mastery. And all of this is around the fifth discovery, which are these trusting, resonant relationships. Now, what does this have to do with the exercise we just did? I started asking this question in my lectures and classes, as I mentioned, in 1999. In 2000, a group of doctoral students started working with me doing research on people's answers. So we would interview, the doctoral students would interview various folks in our various graduate programs. The average age of my graduate students in the courses I teach is 44. So I'm very much focused on folks. Actually, I don't even teach 30-year-olds anymore, but on folks on the whole spectrum, really from 28 to 65 and now 75 years old. And what's very, very clear around this process is that when you ask people, as I did you, tell me about someone who helped you the most, 80 to 100% of all of the stories. If I could take, of the 276 of you who are on this call, if I could take, and let's say you average 2 stories each, so we have 550 or so stories, 80 to 100% of all those stories would be about someone. It could be your mother or your father. Many of you mentioned your mother in the initial chat box. It could be an aunt or an uncle, a grandparent, a teacher, a coach, an early supervisor, a manager. But they have a conversation with you that makes you feel as if you've opened up. It's a conversation about the ideal self. It's not, you're a girl, you should be a nurse. It's, what have you dreamed of? What's exciting? And literally you feel generalized in terms of an excitement about living, because now all of a sudden there's something that really tweaks your imagination, your curiosity. And that's key. Now, sometimes it's also about strengths, where a person believes in you and gives you a job or a role that you didn't think you were up to, but they really believe in your strengths. They see strengths in you that you don't. The dilemma is that when we ask the converse in the research, we ask who tried to help you in the last 2 years, whether it's a manager doing a performance review or a therapist or a teacher, anybody. 67% of the stories come back with the real self. They gave me data about how I'm coming across. They told me, they gave me feedback about how I'm doing. And they said, I can help you with your motivation problem. I can help you be a better team player. I can help you with your empathy. And the simple question we ask is, how did you feel in those moments? And the exact opposite in 67% of the stories to what happened in the prior question. People felt as if they'd been punched. So it became clear to us that, and I started to enhance in my theory in the year 2000, how you moved from one of these moments of emergence to the next is by experiencing, in complexity theory, what's called a tipping point or a trigger point. It's a small movement that leads you to a big change. And I think inside of each one of us, we have two emotional attractors. If you're into complexity reading, these are Lorenz or strange attractors. They bring you around them, not into them. The positive emotional attractor is being in the parasympathetic hormonal activation, which I'll from the rest of this talk call renewal, and activating the empathic, or what's technically called the default mode network neurologically, and using positive adjectives to describe how you feel and what's going on. The negative emotional attractor is the opposite on each of these three dimensions. It's the sympathetic nervous system arousal, which is stress. It's the analytic network, technically called the task positive network, and it's negative feelings. This is the difference between possibilities, focusing on possibilities versus problems, dreams versus expectations, optimism versus pessimism. I love this one. Optimists call themselves optimists. What do pessimists call themselves? Realists. It's the difference between thinking about hope versus fear, strengths versus weaknesses, excited about something you want to try versus something you should do, a performance improvement plan. It's the difference between novelty and expectations, resonant versus dissonant relationships. Now, here are the two most important learnings from my talk. I've been writing about it with many of my both empirical articles as well as theoretical pieces. Our more recent book, Helping People Change, which came out 2 years ago from Harvard Business Review Press, focuses on how you help, whether as an educator, a teacher, a therapist, a physician, nurse, coach, trainer, manager, parent. How do you help people be open to learn and change? We do review all of the different research studies, the fMRI neurological studies, the hormonal studies, as well as all of the longitudinal behavioral studies. But the book is written for normal people, so it's written with a lot of stories, and then we feature the research in that context. And I mention that because one of the things that becomes clear when you look at what happens when you try to start helping someone in the negative emotional attractor. See, I contend the two most important learnings coming out of this, my session and the book and all the work up to now, even the MOOC, is that sustained desired change or learning starts in the positive emotional attractor. It does not start in the negative emotional attractor. And this is a big fallacy. People think, well, the way you motivate somebody to learn is give them a test and show them how little they know or how stupid they are or how difficult it is for them. And that turns out to be the exact opposite. We know that stress compromises a person's cognitive functioning. We know that it moves your peripheral vision, which for most people is about 180 degrees, down to 30 degrees. It moves you from being able to think creatively and thinking about emotions and being open to change. It moves you into the opposite. When you start in the negative emotional attractor, you close people down. This is why people who try to lose weight can't. They're framing their goals and their vision of what they want to do negatively. And they'll lose weight and then they'll gain it. And they'll lose weight and they'll gain it because they never really came to grips with what it is they wanted. We know treatment adherence. If you do what your physician or nurse tells you after you have a surgical procedure or after you go through rehab or get over an illness. Treatment adherence in almost every major disease around the world is 50% or less. That's about how much people do of what people tell them to do. And we know it from type 2 diabetics. We know it from orthopedic surgery, knee replacement or broken ankles. Cardiac bypass surgery treatment adherence is told to me by my cardiothoracic surgeon students as 20%. Why? It's because physicians and nurses try to scare the hell out of you. They approach it in the negative emotional tractor. Well, if you're pre-diabetic, or a diabetic, if you don't exercise more, eat certain foods, and lose weight, we know that it will get worse. We'll have to give you sugar suppressants, then injecting insulin, then at some point you'll get neuropathy, and we'll have to amputate your feet, and all these kinds of things. Are those motivating? No. Or more importantly, they motivate you to try something for a few days or a few weeks, and then you say, the hell with it. So one of the great fallacies of helping is that even though we want to have a positive impact, our intentions are good, when we start with the negative or quote unquote feedback, we're actually closing the person down. So one of the dilemmas is that constructive criticism is still criticism and it doesn't help. If your intention is to help the person learn and change. If you want to just vomit on them, fine, it helps. But if you're trying to motivate them to learn and change in a sustainable way, that kind of stuff doesn't. For educators, tests. Tests are one of the most ridiculous ways to assess learning. And I've been studying this for 40 some years. Tests increase the likelihood in which the student crams. And we know from a lot of research in the science of learning that the more a person crams, the more they dump immediately afterwards. I mean, one piece of data showed from a required course for 30-year-olds in a top 20 ranked MBA program, their first intro accounting course, they could only produce on the same final exam half of what they could 6.5 weeks later. That was the half-life of knowledge. And we know from leadership training in governments and organizations and in education that the honeymoon period is you might dabble with change for 3 weeks to 3 months, and then the honeymoon period's over and you revert. I think the same thing is true of a lot of our attempts. Well-intended, but when we appeal to the negative emotional attractor, we're coming across as helping bullies. The second is that we need both of these. I call this thrive and survive. The PEA is thriving. Some people call it flourishing. The negative emotional attractor is surviving. You need that. If you didn't have a big dose of that this morning, you would not have woken up. If you don't have a certain amount of it later this afternoon or this evening, you won't figure out what you want to have for dinner. So we need the NEA. We need stress. But the problem is, in this day and age, we are exposed to so much, especially those of us in professional roles, we're exposed to so much mild, annoying stress. Now we have, because of COVID and all the geopolitical garbage going on, we have acute stressors. We're overloaded. So it's very clear that for us to have a balance in life, we have to oversample the PEA. Barb Fredrickson has shown effective teams have 3 more times PEA to NEA experiences. John Gottman, studying stable, loving marriages, shows that it's 5 times more PEA to NEA. My neuroimaging studies have shown in coaching and helping undergraduates and graduate students, it's at least 2 to 3 times PEA to NEA if you want to have some semblance of movement. Now, what that means is that a part of our job, a part of our role as an educator, as a manager or leader, as a helper, as a parent, is to motivate people to be open to learning and change. We call that coaching with compassion, which is another way to say coaching to the PEA. We're using a Confucian interpretation of compassion, caring for others. And this is quite opposite to what we often do as managers and all too often as teachers. We coach for compliance. And of course, as parents, here's what you should do for your well-being. We know that our minds work very, very openly with other people's minds, except for people on the autism spectrum, which are a small percentage of people. We pick up in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second, milliseconds, we pick up the emotions of others. Not what they think they're showing, but what they're really feeling. Joseph Ledoux showed this in the late 90s. And we now have evidence to suggest that this is happening all the time. So the question, even pre-COVID, is how are you infecting the people around you? How are you infecting your students? How are you infecting your colleagues? How are you infecting your family? The PEA and NEA have three axes, positive, negative, people understand. Let me talk for a moment about stress versus renewal. When you have a mild stress episode, within a matter of seconds, your brain activates a set of endocrines, which are hormones and neurotransmitters. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, which the Brits call adrenaline, noradrenaline, goes in so it moves blood to your large muscle groups so you can fight or flight. But it's also shunting blood from certain capillaries in your brain that are considered by your body non-essential. So the networks in your brain that your body decides are essential have to do with breathing and movement. They don't have to do with learning. Your body excretes another major set of endocrines called corticosteroids because cortisol enters your bloodstream and it's your body's natural anti-inflammatory. But the problem is when cortisol is in your bloodstream, a number of things happen. First, your immune system shuts down. So all of a sudden, within minutes, you're vulnerable to all the bugs and microbes around you. Secondly, neurogenesis is significantly inhibited to the point where most people say it's just turned off. Neurogenesis in the adult human brain is stem cells from your olfactory lobe and your the top of your hippocampus, inside in there, about the middle part of your brain. Those stem cells can become new neurons. You're going to lose about 85,000 neurons today. They're going to die. Now, don't go out screaming and don't decide to down a whole bottle of Chipuro with lunch, because if you're living even close to a reasonable lifestyle, you actually are replacing that in a prodigious rate. If you're not, by the way, you will have early onset, and even in your 40s, you'll start to have this spongy quality in your brain appear where you have a lot of spaces that we see in autopsied Alzheimer's or dementia patients. So all this is going on under these even mild or annoying stress episodes, and you don't feel on top of your game. Then somebody comes to you and says, where's the report that's due Friday? You react, if you don't say it, as what's it to you? Which, outside of New York City is a defensive response. And we start to see things as threatening that may not be. This is why social media is so dangerous, especially to adolescents, which I'd extend up to 25-year-olds, which is social media almost always goes along with more frequent use of any kind, including texting, with more frequent anxiety and depression. Now, if all this is going on, how come you're not dead? Well, I've got two possibilities. One, you are. And isn't this what you thought heaven was? No, and I offend anybody if you think I'm being sacrilegious. I am. This is why. Our bodies have the parasympathetic nervous system built in, which does the opposite for the sympathetic nervous system. That's why I call the sympathetic stress, which it is, and I call this renewal. Because in this state, and this happens when you see a little baby laughing or a golden retriever puppy rolling in the grass. This is the state I believe many of you entered for about 4 or 5 minutes during the exercise. You start to release primarily oxytocin if you're female, primarily vasopressin if you're male. At this dosage level, these change They don't shunt your blood away from your distal capillaries. They open up your capillaries. So you start to feel warmer throughout your body. Your pulse rate drops. Your blood pressure drops. Your breathing gets deeper and slower. It's in this state that your immune system kicks into high gear. It doesn't make up for immunosuppressed problems, but it will allow your immune system to work its best. It's in this state that repeated research studies have shown you're the most creative, you can handle the most complex concepts, you have the ability to multitask cognitively. Many published studies on these, and a series of studies showing that if you are in a stress state with a 30-degree span of vision, a shot of oxytocin or vasopressin, literally in the experiments, they do it with a nasal spray, all of a sudden opens you back up. You're scanning the environment. This becomes very important because the renewal issue has to do with 2 levels for you. Actually, in education, it has to do with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels. First level, you want to be inspiring more renewal than stress in your students.
Costa.
Otherwise, sorry, somebody's talking over the mic.
Please, everybody, close.
You want to inspire more renewal than stress each week in your students because that's where they're open to learning. 2, that's the teacher's primary job. 2, the principals or headmaster or headmistress of a school or in universities, department chairs want to stimulate more renewal than stress in their teachers, in their faculty. 3, the chancellors or administrators of a whole school system, we call them superintendents, or at universities, deans, need to be doing this for the department chairs, otherwise they can't do it. And at the other level, you need to be doing it for yourself. Because if you aren't feeling excited about life, you're infecting everybody with your fatigue, your negativity, and your NEA. Now we know from, I don't put something on this list unless I've seen a minimum of 5 published studies in medicine or psychology, and ones that show this effect I'm about to talk about for men and women, people of different races, cultures, faiths. We know that meditation helps renewal. Even 15 to 20 minutes 3 times a week helps you access renewal. We know that yoga does. We know that Tai Chi does. And it's not the kick-ass parts, it's the centering parts. We know that prayer does, as long as you're praying to a loving God. We know that exercise does if it's modest. We know that feeling hopeful about the future does, which is why you shouldn't watch the news on television. We know that being in a loving, stable relationship does. We know that caring for people in the community who are less fortunate increases renewal. We know that caring for the elderly increases renewal. That's why I tell my students, caring for elderly professors will get you closer to heaven. And we know that having a pet that you can stroke, a dog, cat, and in some parts of the world, horses or monkeys, helps. This actually has been documented since the 70s. That I have 2 golden retrievers, and over the 45 years of our marriage, my wife because I'm very nerdy and very focused and research and things like that, and my wife has continued to tell me I would be a lot healthier if every time one of the dogs comes up to me and wants me to pet her, I stop what I'm doing and pet her for a little bit. And I've got to say, over the last 20 years, I've been doing that. And, I start to pet her. She goes into a parasympathetic nervous system response. I pick it up because of the emotional contagion, the brain-to-brain stuff. Then I'm feeling it, and then she's feeling it more, and we're having a whole moment here. We also know that laughter, joy, and playfulness does it. Being happy, not necessarily, it depends. Sometimes happy leads to complacency, but laughter, joy, and playfulness does. And now we know that a walk in nature does. I just read an article 3 weeks ago, but I haven't seen replication of it, so I'm not putting it on a list yet, that playing music or dancing does. Listening to music has a little bit of an effect, but it's there's too much variance. But if you're playing music or if you're um, dancing, it does. I'm looking forward to seeing more replications to be able to put it on the list. So here's the key. I've been saying this since I was doing therapy with folks in the 70s, that you need more renewal than stress. People who try to help people reduce their stress are doing the wrong thing. So they're going to have mild stress. They're still going to have all the problems of stress. The key is renewal is the only antidote. So what you want to do is increase the number of moments of renewal. And by the way, in a study that, a series of studies that we did 6 years ago, and then again 3 years ago, Dan Goldman and I did, we came up with a new test called Personal Sustainability Index to look at what's your balance on a normal week, an ordinary week like last week, of things that might happen between renewal and stress. And what we were able to show is that the amount of renewal compared to the amount of stress, you have to have more renewal to stress to have more engagement in work, more career satisfaction, more sense of well-being, more resilience, more empathy, and less depression, less anxiety, and so forth. The interesting discovery in that is it doesn't mean long periods of time. The most powerful way people introduce renewal in their lives is in brief doses, 15 minutes, 10-minute doses. So it's very important to have breaks throughout the day in which you're being able to do this. Even in our classrooms, I try to make, like I did in this talk, I try to make sure in every talk I do or class, there is an exercise that people go into an emotional space for a moment of renewal every hour. Because that helps increase their likelihood that they'll remember anything else from the rest of my class. The other thing we discovered in these series of studies that we published last year is that the variety of things you do are as powerful in predicting all these good things in your body and life as the amount of time. So sticking to just one thing will mean you're just changing fixation and habits. So part of managing the joy of life, part of helping yourself be excited about life, part of helping you help others be open to learning and change and the excitement of life is managing the PEA-NEA. And what I've done here is I've gone in more depth about one axis of it in terms of renewal versus stress. So what we're saying is that when coaching, or substitute the word for teaching here or helping, you don't want the student to decide the agenda. You want the context to be their dream in life, their sense of purpose, not goals. And you want it to be based in some caring relationship. Now, we have a total of 39 published longitudinal studies, the largest chunk of which are on 25 to 35-year-olds, but a few are on the 45 to 55-year-olds, showing that when you use our approach to coaching and helping people, you're getting about a 62% improvement in emotional and social intelligence behavior, as seen by others, not self-assessment, 1 to 2 years after the course or the intervention. And it atrophies, as you go out 5 to 7 years, but it holds at about a 50% improvement. Now, the reason this is so powerful is when this was in a MBA programs, full-time, when we compared other above average, highly ranked MBA programs, they had about a 2% impact within the first year or two, and then it drops even lower. And in fact, one of the discoveries was that highly ranked MBA programs, full-time programs, have a tendency to atrophy. A person graduates with less social intelligence than they had when they entered. I'll explain why, because it's a neurological issue. But even in government and industry, the average is about 11%, and then it drops off. So we're having this huge impact because we're in the whole first third of the learning experience, whether we're dealing with the MBAs or the 50-year-old executives, or in my case, sometimes I'm dealing with teachers or principals or headmasters or faculty. We spend the whole first third talking about the vision and the dream and a person's sense of purpose. We try to make it holistic. We try to have one-on-one coaching around it. And then by the middle third, when we start to introduce assessments, we also focus on peer coaching, where people in small groups are helping each other. And we focus mostly on weaknesses. The third dimension of a PEA-NEA is the analytic. I talked about this, and Professor Tony Jack at Case Western has done a lot of research on this, following in the footsteps of others that have started writing about this since about 2005. We have two major networks in our brain. We have thousands of them, but two that affect us a lot each day. The analytic network is also called the task positive network. It's parts of the prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, different parts of your brain. It's not this left brain, right brain, because that's bullshit. That's, that went out as soon as people started doing research on this stuff. That was kind of like psycho magic that was pop psych in the 90s. Every part of the brain has right and left, and they do different things. So if you really want to stay current with neuroscience, you have to be doing research and or reading the current stuff. And right now, everybody's looking at networks. This analytic network in different parts of your brain helps you solve problems and focus. Do anything analytic, activates it. The empathic network, posterior cingulate cortex, parts of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, other parts of the cingulate insula. This helps you be open to learning or new ideas. It helps you be open to people and emotions. And actually, it helps you think about the larger issue of moral concerns, not right and wrong, because that's an analytic judgment, and that does the analytic network, but is it fair? What Tony showed, and this was a major study that he did that is published with 80 people, is that when you activate the analytic network, you suppress the empathic network. These two networks have almost no overlap, and they suppress each other. The same way the stress suppresses renewal and renewal suppresses stress. These are antagonistic networks. This is why if we focus too much on analytic work, we suppress people's openness to new ideas. Why do full-time MBAs often atrophy on their social intelligence? Because in the first semester, they get a course. If it's a course about analytic network activation, I'm going to do this hand. If it's empathic, I'll do this hand. First semester, they do a course in accounting. They do a course in statistics. They do a course in finance. They do a course in economics. And somebody says, let's have them analyze Harvard Business School cases. No wonder the poor 28-year-olds within 2 years have their social intelligence shriveled. This is where in our classrooms, trying to engage the students in ways that go back and forth are key. Look, we have to engage the analytic and the empathic. As a helper, we want to use both of those in ourselves to understand our students, our clients, our subordinates, our family. But when you overemphasize one, that's what happens to your students or your associates. That's what you're activating. So the idea is to use pedagogy. I remember in the early 70s trying to teach elementary and secondary school teachers how to bring even values and emotion into teaching of geography and mathematics, which is all possible. So what we're talking about is that these networks operate like a seesaw. The same thing with the renewal stress, same thing with positive negatives. The PEA, NEA end up being forces that you want to create somehow a balance. How do we know what that balance looks like? So, well, we did an fMRI study in which we had, this was with 18 and 19-year-olds. We gave 30 minutes of coaching to their dream. If your life were absolutely perfect 10 years from now, what would it be like? That's all they talked about with the coach for 30 minutes. Or tell me about problems you're having in your courses. How are you doing? You're doing all the readings, getting enough time from your instructor. It wasn't really negative, but it was guilt-inducing. 3 to 5 days later, they went into an fMRI, and sure enough, we found that the vision-oriented coaching activated parts of the empathic network, and it activated the lateral cortex back here, this orange area, which is where we go to dream. So we got an award, a couple of awards for that. We're in the process of getting it published. We did another study, this time with 21-year-olds. Again, it's always half male, half female, randomly assigned. And this time we upped it to 50 people instead of 20. And we had them do either one PEA or two PEAs or three PEAs. So we, as well as the NEA 30-minute coaching. We wanted to see about dose dependent. And sure enough, we replicated the earlier findings, but we showed that 2 or 3 PEA to 1 NEA session activated this yellow area called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is the area which Naomi Eisenberger has shown in many published studies activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the renewal process. So what I've done today is given you 18 ideas that you could use to increase your openness to learning and change, that can increase your excitement about life, that can increase your sense of well-being and your resilience. And these are specifics. Now, if you're doing some of them, I hope this session has helped affirm why you should continue. If you aren't doing some of them, consider working them in. Again, don't try big changes, try little changes. What we're saying is when you're trying to help others, whether as a teacher, as a manager, as a parent, you want to work on their vision or the caring relationship that you have with them. Occasionally, you might work on strengths, but your leverage is bringing them into these PEA moments more frequently. And because natural life goes to the NEA, as it should, ecologically, we have to defend our bodies. But so very often you're in the challenge of bringing people back into the PEA. Sorry to be so crass, but I'm very proud of our book that Professors Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Osten and I, after 20 some years of research on the coaching, produced. So let me leave you with a closing thought, and then I'll open it up to questions. You owe it to yourself to be moving closer to your dreams. We have a very special gift from our God, life. Let's not waste it. And if those of us in this webinar, which constitute maybe 400, 500 million of the people on earth today that can move closer to our vision, our dreams, our sense of purpose, which is to say, I would say about 6.5 billion people on earth today can't because they're living in war zones or under political or economic or spiritual repression. If you asked any of them, they'd say, go for it, don't waste it. So how do you do that? How do you inspire others to want to learn and change? You do it by making sure first that you're inspired and that you're renewed, and then you can open them up. So besides all the things I talked about today, the 19th technique is remember the moment. Remember a moment when you were a kid before a vacation or a holiday. Remember maybe in secondary school before a sports game, your first date, your first kiss. Remember your first published article or your first app for those of you who are tech millionaires. Remember your your first product or service in your job, or if you're a teacher, the first course you taught. And if you're older, remember your first marriage, the birth of your first child. These are major moments in our lives. And you know what happens when you remember that moment, just like you did with the person who helped you the most? It re-stimulates that excitement. You get filled with this energy, this PEA, and you become positively infectious, and you'll start to see in your families, in your communities, and at work, people coming together and doing things that before that you thought might have been impossible. Okay. Fiquei para